In the State of the Union address, President Biden alluded to the Chinese spy balloon incident in a single line, which suggested an effort to contain the spillover from that episode.
As we made clear last week, if China threatens our sovereignty, we will act to protect our country, and we did.
For its part, the Beijing government also seems to have tried to downplay it, expressing regret initially and using its censorship of media and social media not to fan the flames of Chinese nationalism, but rather tamp them down. In the last such crisis, the Chinese government seemed to encourage anti-Americanism in its media. In 2001, an American spy plane collided with a Chinese jet fighter, killing the Chinese pilot and forcing the American plane to land at Hainan Island, where Chinese authorities took the crew into custody. After 11 tense days, the United States issued a letter of regret, which the Chinese characterized as an apology. Beijing then released the Americans. It is difficult to imagine an incident like that one getting resolved so quickly and easily today. We're watching something almost unique in history, a growing geopolitical rivalry between two nations that are also deeply interconnected economically. In the wake of the suspected spy balloon, this week brought news that US-China trade in goods hit an all-time high of $690 billion, surpassing the previous record set in 2018 before the COVID pandemic. That number seems especially remarkable when you consider that it was achieved despite the tariffs that Donald Trump placed on many Chinese goods and those that China placed on US goods in response. It also runs counter to the Biden administration's new rules preventing trade in certain high-technology items with the People's Republic. We are operating on two levels with China. One is geopolitical, where tensions have been growing rapidly, but the other is commercial, and it is determined largely by Chinese and American consumers and firms, not governments. That relationship remains deeply intertwined and interdependent. Can these two realms continue to move forward while working at cross purposes? It seems highly unlikely. In an essay in Foreign Affairs, former U.S. Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson notes that during the 2008 global financial crisis, good relations with China helped Washington avert another Great Depression. You see, China held massive amounts of American debt as well as American housing bonds issued by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Had Beijing sold those, it could have created a downward spiral for the American economy with fallout around the world. But Washington persuaded Beijing not to sell, and in fact, China used its own fiscal and monetary strength to boost the global economy. It's sobering to think that the next global financial crisis, for there will be one, will likely see none of that kind of policy coordination between the world's two largest economies. The geopolitical tensions are likely to grow fast. This week also brought news that was actually more significant than a wandering balloon. The U.S. Strategic Command, which oversees the U.S. nuclear arsenal, has informed Congress that China now has more land-based, fixed and mobile intercontinental ballistic missile launchers than the U.S. As relations between Washington and Beijing have deteriorated, Beijing has moved rapidly to build up its nuclear arsenal. It still has many fewer nuclear warheads than the U.S., but according to a Pentagon report last fall, it is on a path to more than triple its stock by 2035. At that point, we will be in a world in which three major powers each have large and sophisticated nuclear arsenals. And two of those powers, Russia and China, are allied, and both will be primarily targeting the United States. And then there is Taiwan. We face a long-term buildup of Beijing's military capability to invade or more likely blockade the island. But we also face potential short-term crises, including the one that will surely be triggered if House Speaker Kevin McCarthy does travel to the island and, even more provocatively, announces support for Taiwanese independence. Taiwan will be holding presidential elections in 2024. President Tsai Ing-wen cannot run again because of term limits, but her party has chosen as its likely candidate a man who says he is a worker for Taiwanese independence. So far, public sentiment suggests that most Taiwanese do not want independence right now, preferring for the time being the ambiguous status quo that has allowed them to thrive and prosper. But that too could change if Beijing's bullying ramps up. Right now, Washington and Beijing have few guardrails to keep problems from escalating. China and the United States have no bilateral arms control agreements, unlike with Russia, or even ongoing negotiations about security. There are no military-to-military dialogues about crisis management. There is no continuous discussion between the two sides' economic teams. If the next crisis between Beijing and Washington is bigger than a balloon, it might prove much harder to deflate. Let me bring David Miliband and Richard Haas in on the US-China relations discussion. David is the former British Foreign Secretary and now the President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee. Richard is a former top State Department official, now the President of the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of a new book, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens, which debuted on the New York Times bestseller list. Richard, I assume you think that the Biden administration, broadly speaking, handled the China episode pretty well. But I want to ask you, because you were the guy who Colin Powell dispatched to negotiate with the Chinese in that 2001 episode. And the way it was solved was the United States offered this regret, which the Chinese were able to interpret and translate as an apology. Given the political climate in Washington, where the Republicans are just baying for blood on this, could you have solved the problem in that way this time?
I think the answer is we could have, but it would have come at greater political cost or price. There's almost a competition going on, Fareed, between the parties. Who can be tougher on China? Indeed, there's hardly a lot of difference between the Trump administration policy and now the Biden. And it's going to be difficult going forward. I mean, this was a balloon. Imagine we have a real crisis over, say, Taiwan, where ships or aircraft come into close proximity or contact. Well, how are the United States and China going to manage that? We don't seem to have the lines of communication, and the political environment has so deteriorated over the last 20 years. It's in some ways worse than the United States and the Soviet Union were at even the height of the Cold War.
You had said initially, you tweeted that you thought Tony Blinken should not have canceled his trip.
Right.
Do you think he should go as soon as possible?
Yes, sir, because when I look at the real differences between the United States and China over, say, Taiwan, that has more potential to bring the two into blows than anything else. Or there's growing evidence of Chinese support for Russia and Ukraine, both direct and indirect, obviously economic support, but also potentially military support. So I think we have really pressing reasons to get the Secretary of State over there. I don't think it's necessarily going to cause, create miracles, but I don't see how we're served by not having a serious relationship. Plus, China clearly erred here. They got overly aggressive, even brazen. So I think this is not a bad moment.
David, one part of the sort of Biden administration strategy toward China, which is in some ways a continuation of the Trump administration, is this very tough economic competition. But it's competition not, there are two ways you can compete. One, you try to run faster, but the other is you try to trip the other guy. And there's a lot of us trying to trip the other guy, restraints on technology, restraints on exports. Do you think that Europe, broadly speaking, is on board with this strategy that the United States is adopting toward China?
Well, I think that Europeans have changed their tune significantly over the last 5 years. They will have been relieved last weekend that the administration was firm but not macho about this balloon incident. But they will be really urging that the cooperate part of the triad that says confront, compete, and cooperate, that cooperate part gets filled out. Because at the moment, whether it be on global health or on the global climate, you see very little cooperation in areas that in themselves speak to the global commons and the responsibilities of great states. Then when you think about the Russia-China axis or link over Ukraine, the voting together on a whole range of issues at the UN, you see the parties very far apart, and if anything, cleaving further apart. And the great fear, I think not just in Europe actually, but across the rest of the world, is going to be that these two countries that are competing so ferociously, that the competition bleeds into every aspect of international relations and freezes out the kind of cooperation and diplomacy that is so essential.
Richard, when I was in India, I was talking to a bunch of Indian businessmen who were talking about how the big opportunity for them was now doing business in Russia, taking the businesses that Western firms had left behind. And it speaks to one of the reasons why the Russian economy is doing better than we think is there's a big world out there, and it's not just the West anymore. It's, China and India, but also Turkey. Apparently, Iran's trade with Russia has gone up a lot. In that context, it seemed this is a point Larry Summers made last week on the show. If we can't isolate Russia, it's going to be much harder to isolate China economically.
Oh, you can't isolate China. China's too big, and it's already too there. That horse has left the barn, and multiple horses have left multiple barns at the risk of stretching it. So it says a lot about sanctions. It turns out in government, almost every crisis, the first thing the State Department does is, you don't want to go to war, you don't want to do nothing, sanctions. We overuse the instrument, we ask way too much of it. And what you're suggesting is we're living in a world, particularly if China's the target of the sanctions, where the ability of sanctions to deliver is, I think, less and less and less. A country like India is going to potentially, though, gain twice. First, it's now trading with Russia, oil and other things. Then, where we do limit our relationship with China economically, guess what? India may be in a position to step in. Apple and others may one day be making their phones more in India than in China. So I think India might actually be fairly well positioned here.
What about Britain? We haven't had you on since the latest fiascos in Britain with, for example, the IMF now says Britain is going to be the worst performing major economy in the world. Is this all just the bitter fruit of Brexit?
Well, please don't introduce this as the fragile states section of the programme. That would just be too painful. Look, 2022 was a terrible year for the UK because its great virtues, which are meant to be pragmatism and stability and common sense, were thrown out of the window by a whole series of populist posturings by the governing party. I think the UK is getting back to some form of normal politics. The Labour Party is now under management that's electable. The Conservatives have got a leader, a Prime Minister, who at least exceeds his two predecessors. So you've got some form of centre-right, centre-left politics. But the hole left by Brexit is very, very large indeed, and it's getting deeper. It's getting deeper economically, and it's getting deeper politically. And at the moment, the ladders haven't been built to get us out of the hole. That's the real task ahead.
All right. Stay with us. When we come back, we're going to talk about Turkey, Syria, the earthquake, and the politics of this natural disaster. David and Richard will be back with me in a moment.